Hello, and welcome back to the Road to 2000s. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and I am your driver on this journey. Today, I wanted to take a look back at some chess history and go over some games from the one and only Bobby Fischer. So why don't we see what made Bobby Fischer Bobby Fischer? So some of you might be familiar, these players all have, all the famous players have, their immortal game, or there's some fancy name for some of their best games. Bobby Fischer has actually played a game that's been deemed the game of the century. So probably not this century, but they were talking about the 1900s. Bobby Fischer played the game of the century, and I thought, what better game to start off on, looking at some games from his career than this one. And so this is a game Bobby played when he was quite young against Donald Byrne, who was a very strong master at the time. And Bobby Fischer actually had black. So let me flip it around here. And the game started off knight f3, knight f6, c4, g6. And we see that after d4, castles. Black has adopted a King's Indian setup. He simply fianchettoed, brought the knight out, and got castled early on. White now has a couple options. He can go into the King's Indian defense with this move, e4, or he can just play a little bit more quietly. e4, I would say, is kind of the most principled testing way to play, right? Your opponent didn't take the center, so you grabbed the center completely. The downside to this is, of course, you're making some weaknesses along the way. And after a move like d6, in c5 or e5, black is fighting for the dark squares. And that's just kind of the King's Indian defense. In the game, white chose bishop f4, which is a slightly less aggressive option, I would say. It's grabbing this e5 square, but it's allowing black to now make a claim in the center with d5. Now that e4 hasn't been played, d5 is in fact possible. And we transpose into some lines of the Grunfeld, actually.
So it went from like a King's Indian to a Grunfeld.
Yeah, these two openings share a lot in common. The difference is really whether or not black puts this pawn on d5 or leaves this pawn back on d6. And so in this case, black grabbed the center with d5. And white's response was queen b3. And this is kind of transposing into some more popular lines where I think queen b3 has played a move earlier in the Grunfeld, actually. Black simply captures. Yeah, of course, the d5 pawn under some pressure. So black removes the pressure by taking on c4. And now after queen takes c4, black plays c6. And white does, in fact, grab the center. So this still isn't going to be transposing into the King's Indian defense here. That ship kind of sailed when black played d5. But white is still making a very strong claim in the center now with e4. So this is a pretty striking position. We often think like the ideal setup for one player is kind of this, with the knights in the center, the bishops coming to the center, and the central pawn duo. So what does black have in exchange for it here? Why would Bobby play like this? Why would he give his opponent such a strong center?
Well, he's going to attack it, I think, later,
Exactly.
So those pawns, even though they're a duo in the center, they don't have support. So if he makes the right lever breaks, he can,
So yeah, what would those breaks be? How is black actually going to challenge the center? It's not super clear to see. Usually when we see an opening like this, where white has grabbed the center and black hasn't, black usually is playing for some pawn break, something to free his position. Whether, in this case, there are a few ways to kind of attack these pawns, like c5 would attack the d4 pawn, e5 would challenge these centers, and f5 would challenge the e4 pawn. But looking at these three moves, none of them really seem plausible here. Right. It's really tough to achieve any of those pawn breaks.
I would think first he might move that bishop out and hit the knight on f3 to listen this appeal on the center. And then he might go e6 and just fix that d5 square and almost, then think about trying to hit black.
So I like some of what you're saying. I like getting this bishop out to g4. I'm not super convinced about this e6 move.
No, I wouldn't do that because he might push or something. which might be
Yeah.
weak.
Well, you're giving up important squares. Whenever you push these pawns forward, you give up important squares. And so the main idea I want to get across here, this is a pretty interesting line, because black isn't exactly trying to challenge the center using a pawn break like c5 or e5 or f5. Instead, he's using his pieces to challenge the center as opposed to his pawns. And so we'll see how Bobby manages to, quite expertly maneuver his pieces around to put a lot of pressure onto this black center. So, onto the white center. So black actually starts with knight b d7, developing this knight out first.
We're gonna hit the queen, get her out.
Rook d1. Black does continue with knight b6, forcing this queen onto a slightly less pleasant square. Queen c5 is played. And now, simply bishop g4 from black, just getting his piece developed. And as you said, putting pressure on this knight in turn puts pressure on this central d4 pawn by removing a defender. We saw now bishop g5 from white. And what do you think of this move? What's the idea? And is it a good idea?
I don't know. I might have liked that diamond keeping that rook off of b8, but the rook's gonna go to c8 anyway. So, is he gonna try to castle kingside and then go f4 or something? Is that what he's thinking about to stabilize his pawns?
Okay, so you're thinking he put the bishop out of the way for an eventual f4? Is that what you're saying?
I was thinking he might, but he might have to do f3 because his pawns are.
Yeah, so.
He got to steal castle and stuff. Wouldn't have wasted a move like that. I would have gone bishop e2 or something, and then castle.
Right.
See what I'm saying? Because by that bishop f4, it's not anything forcing. It's not doing anything.
So this is the rule that I've stated before in these classes. Bishop g5 breaks an opening principle, right? You're not supposed to move the same piece over and over again until you're fully developed and you get castled. And so it's quite often when it's best to break one of these opening principles, right? The best move has to ignore some principle. But the fact is, you have to be very certain that you're breaking the principle for a good reason. You're making a significant threat, you're causing a significant problem, or you're somehow improving your position, which you have to do right away. Otherwise, it's always just going to be best to follow opening principles. Finish development, get castled, and that's exactly what white should have done here, is just finish development and getting castled. The idea with bishop g5, as I see it, was just to put pressure on this e7 pawn, make it so this knight couldn't really go anywhere, couldn't really pressure the center, because eventually, if this knight moves, there's always going to be ideas of this pawn hanging. Even takes with the bishop is sometimes going to be a problem. And this was white's idea.
His king is in the center. He can't be pivoting around trying to jump tactics that early with his king still sitting there.
Well, I mean, sometimes you can, but you just have to be certain. You have to be certain when you play a move like bishop g5. And I don't know if white thought that he was certain, but he shouldn't have been, because Bobby came up with a very nice move here to prove white's mistake. So I'll let you guys try and find a tactical line here that really shows why white's play has been incorrect. And this is a killer move. So if you haven't seen the game before, don't feel bad if you can't find this one, because it's pretty unnatural.
I know about the game, but I don't really know the specifics of it.
Yeah, no, there's some crazy tactics by Bobby here.
Hey, I'm looking at how them knights might come to play and hit his queen. He might pop the knight in the center and do stuff.
So yeah, we're looking at this queen, which seems a little bit overextended. And that's where a lot of tactics come from, is pieces that are loose or kind of over-advanced, overextended, and can easily be attacked. So which pieces look a little bit loose to your eyes here? We've talked about the queen. Any other pieces? Or pawns, or squares? What else sticks out besides just this queen that might be a little bit susceptible?
Well, if you take that f3 knight, that's going to force him to come back like that, but I don't know what else you would do. But where does he castle if he do something like that?
Well, okay, that's an interesting idea. So even looking without tactics, we do have this option, bishop takes f3, g takes f3, forcing this g pawn onto f3. And you mentioned this idea of where's white going to castle after g takes f3.
He's going to go e2.
But
that's where he's going to happen.
you think king e2?
Well, he can't castle, he's moved the other rook. Well, he could go bishop g2 and castle, you're right.
That's the thing here, is this is a very common idea for white in the Grunfeld, actually. Playing this move, bishop takes f3, even while the queen is still on d1, white will very often want to capture back with the f-pawn, because it supports the center, and it allows for ideas like f4, f5 to come through a lot more quickly. And the fact is, how is black ever going to use this g file?
Yeah,
it's a little bit unclear.
G6, yeah, his structure is not set to exploit that.
Right. So bishop takes f3 usually isn't the best idea in a lot of Grunfeld positions. Now, sometimes it is.
Weakens that d4 pawn, right?
That's true.
It might, now the knight can switch over and you know, the killer bishop comes out, you know, like in the dragon. You know,
yeah.
But you do it, I'm doing too many ideas at one time.
So the actual idea revolves around the loose pieces. So that's what I was talking about earlier. This queen on c5 is a loose piece. I asked to try to find some other loose pieces. And one good way to do that is to look for pieces that have the same number of attackers as defenders. So this piece is attacked one time, and it's also defended once.
Right.
So if something happens to that defender, or if another attacker is added somehow, then this pawn could be captured. So I would qualify this pawn as a loose piece. I would actually qualify this bishop as a loose piece. It doesn't perfectly fit the definition. It's defended right now twice, and attacked no times, but things can happen to these attackers, right? Or these defenders.
If the knight went to h4, it'd draw the other knight off, and then that knight could hit the queen and the bishop at the same time.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and that's the move that was played, is knight a4. So what happens on knight takes a4?
Knight takes d4.
Knight takes e4. Yeah, what if simply, let's say, queen b4, for example? What happens on this move? How do we get our piece back? So things get a little bit crazy.
Then he's going to take the rook down there, and then...
Yeah, so knight takes bishop is a good idea, because now there's bishop takes d1, and white has a lot of problems here. What drove you away from this idea of bishop takes knight, though? This looks a little bit more natural.
Well, because then he's going to kick your knight in the middle of the...
Well, then you can take this bishop.
Take the bishop, yeah.
But no, white has something else here, I think, to look out for.
Oh, the queen, like you said, the queen comes down, though. I mean,
well,
the bishop.
Let's look at the bishop, yeah. And now all of a sudden, things are getting a little bit more complicated. This queen can step out of the way. And after takes, now this knight is attacked.
Yeah. I was thinking the knight might hit the L7 pawn, hitting the two rooks. You know, you might have to go all the way, it'll kill the Rado.
Well, that's a ways away from happening. But yeah, there is this knight takes g5 move that I think would be quite good for black. And this isn't actually a specific line I looked at before the lecture, but I think bishop takes here, or even queen d5. There's a lot of moves here that I think are going to be good for black, just because this white king is a little bit isolated in the center.
Yeah, he gets a grand match with a king in the center, that's like dinner.
So, knight takes a4 isn't going to work for white, and white realized this. So simply queen a3.
Right.
And now, after knight takes c3, we see pawn takes c3. And so at first glance, this looks like we've helped white, right? We've strengthened his center. Now this d4 pawn is more or less unassailable. But
but then the knight takes the e4, hits the queen and the bishop, and uncovers the killer bishop.
So yeah, you want to play knight takes e4 here, right? So this is a very good idea, but if you want to play knight takes e4, what do you have to calculate? What's the problem?
Okay, yeah. That's what you just told us about the bishop coming down fucking the queen, so I gotta watch that.
So, I'm sorry, what would happen?
Well, like you said, when the knight takes, your bishop can come down, hit E7, then
Yeah.
you fucking my queen. So I got the, you got to time and calculate, like you said.
So, okay, so if knight takes
maybe
e4,
you
we're
just
worried
need to
about
move
bishop
the
takes
queen and the
e7.
rook out of the way, get one of them pieces out of the way.
Yeah, so let's try to calculate. So knight takes e4, bishop takes e7. What can black play in this case?
The rook over and pin the bishop.
Whoa. So it's not quite pinned yet. This is legal.
Oh, okay.
So you got to be very careful. But yeah, let's put it on the board. What could happen here?
Well, you can move the queen over to E8, and then when he takes the rook or whatever, you can discover attack and might capture the queen, you might pick up another rook. You gotta think what you gotta do here.
Yeah, well, the thing to look out for here is queen e8 is a reasonable move, and I think black should have to move the queen, but white isn't forced to capture. This is a common mistake that happens in a lot of lines that players calculate, where they're like, okay, bishop takes e7, he wants to take my rook. No matter what I do, he's going to take my rook. But in this case, I think you're giving white a chance to actually just develop.
Right.
And so bishop e2 might come on the board. And now I don't know if white is actually doing so poorly. He can simply get castled soon, and this rook is a little bit stuck on f8.
Well, I mean, your man going exchange down, but if he can get out of the center in time, like you said.
Yeah, that's the problem.
If bishop captures knight, then the f3, because he can't do with the bishop, and he don't want to castle with his king looking at that.
Well, let's stay focused. Our queen's attacked. What do we want to do with it?
I want to move it up toward I guess D5.
Yeah, so you should get it out of the way. D5 is an interesting square. I'm not sure it's the best square.
Okay.
You're not really creating any extra threats.
Maybe a little circumspect, safer. D7, is that better?
So you always want to find harmony with your pieces, right? So you're looking at this bishop, which is threatening to take off this knight, which is defending the dark squares. Right. You're looking at this knight on e4, which is attacking the dark squares. And you're looking at this bishop, which is attacking the dark squares.
Right.
So what black wants to do is try and coordinate with these pieces to create some very specific threats. So he's actually staying on the dark squares here, and he plays queen b6, which doesn't immediately make any threats, but it is, keeping an eye on some weak points in the white camp. And
trouble. Yeah.
So you can imagine that, obviously white can't push this pawn, but if anything ever happens to the c3 pawn, then this d4 pawn is looking weak, and the c3 pawn is already under threat. You can imagine things like c5 might bust open this diagonal as well.
So now he got to calculate, can he actually afford to take the rook, or does he need to go back and hit the queen, to get the open file for his piece? I don't know what's going on there.
So what I'm trying to say is you want to use your pieces to work together. This is how you can use active pieces and turn that activity into real threats.
Right.
You can play things like queen d5, and this is a very nice central square for the queen. It's by no means a bad move, but it's not
coordinated with the other piece.
Yeah.
He might even hit like c4, gain a tempo.
So
what you gonna do?
Yeah, try and let me finish my points, and then we can talk about it. But so queen d5, as I was saying, so it's centralized, it's an active square for the queen, but it's not really in harmony with the rest of your pieces. Still puts pressure on d4, but it's not really, adding in these extra threats of getting in on these dark squares. So you want to be looking at your other pieces to see where you're actually trying to aim, and that's how you can use activity to make general threats, or real threats. So we see queen b6. So first of all, what happens if bishop takes f8? What's going on here? Anything special? Or should we just take back and sit on the position?
pull the rook over to E8 and have the discovered check threat.
Yeah, I mean, you can try and make immediate threats like this, but the thing is, your position is already so good that you don't need to be doing this extra fancy stuff. If you just take this bishop back, even after queen b3 and rook e8, even if these queens come off the board, you're up so much time and you have so many weaknesses to look at that you're already just going to be completely winning. For example, if you try to get out of this discovered threats, knight takes c3 is simply hitting this bishop twice. You can play like rook d2, but and I'm just kind of playing moves here. Things like bishop b4, I'm going to say, already look to just be winning the game. You can't castle, because I'll take the bishop. And if this rook ever moves out of the way, I have discovered attacks. And any of these moves. And white is simply lost. And if you don't get out of the discovered threat, if you try to defend this pawn or something, there's simply knight g3. And this rook on h1 will fall. So you don't have to do anything fancy if bishop takes f8. And so white comes up with a better try, and that's bishop c4, finally trying to get developed. We see knight takes c3 from black. The idea being if queen takes c3, well, I'll ask you what is the idea. It's not too complicated. How do we get the piece back?
Move the rook over to the rook at f to e.
Yeah, you just pin the bishop, right? And this bishop can't move. There's no good way to defend it. And if you do defend it, I'll just attack it again. And you'll get the piece back. So queen takes c3, not going to be an option. And white comes up with this move, bishop c5. And so now it looks like we've removed this bishop from this threat of being pinned. We're hitting this knight. We're hitting this queen. So what was black's idea? How is black going to continue here?
Well, at first, I smacked that check in to get his attention.
Sure. You can start with a check, but he'll move out of the way. Let's say king f1.
Let's see, what could I do?
You have two problems to solve. It's not so easy to solve both of them. So there's a rule in chess that I've heard before where it's when your piece is threatened, you have a few options. Sometimes you can defend the piece. For example, this knight is attacked. If we had some way to defend it, then that wouldn't be a problem anymore. You can move the piece out of the way, remove the piece from threat. So example, our queen is attacked. You can move it out of the way. Or you can make a bigger threat. So that's the third thing that makes chess really complicated, is what is a bigger threat?
Knight back to hit his queen by moving the knight back to. Plus, if he takes with the bishop, they give white control of the white squares, and white would be in some real trouble.
Yeah, knight b5 is an interesting idea. This isn't one that came to my mind, but let's take a look at it, see what's going on. So you were saying if bishop takes b5, queen takes b5, and black's got control over these light squares. And I'll agree that does look like trouble. So let's see if we can come up with a better way for white to play here. Any ideas? It's not super easy, but
Right? You could move his knight to E5, hitting the bishop, hanging. And so there he's trying to kind of counter.
Well,
Black queen's hanging and a whole lot of stuff.
white's queen is attacked. So white should probably solve this problem. The move that comes to my mind is something simple.
Oh, yeah,
just queen d3.
Yeah, they got to save the queen. I forgot.
Yeah.
I was just letting that straight. We swapping the queen and going into the end game.
And that piece would still be attacked.
Anyway.
So knight b5 is an interesting idea. Fischer has something better here, and I think white would actually be doing pretty well in that position we just saw.
That's why he's the GM, and I'm just a little secret. But I was least thinking.
So I'll give you the first move. Rook e8 check, you were correct, is the way that black started here. And white does play king f1. And now what could black's idea possibly be here? Come on. Everybody loves to throw away their queen. Especially when it's not your queen and it's somebody else's. Of course, black's idea is to simply play bishop e6, sacrificing the queen. And this is a pretty incredible idea from Bobby here. So if bishop takes queen, this is what was played in the game. And we'll take a look at the continuation after that. Maybe what Byrne missed was what happens on queen takes c3. Seems like a very natural way for white to play. Simply take the free piece. But what does black have here?
He can move his queen over to 8-6 because it's a pin on the bishop.
What?
Oh, no, that's not
yeah.
A pin on the bishop. I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, black could move the queen out of the way, but he's going to be down a piece, right?
I got the queen. I was, in my mind, I switched the queen and the bishop.
Yeah. So what does black have? How do you take the piece back? I think you can find this one. It has to do with what we were talking about, right? Way back here, we put this queen on b6 because we wanted to make more threats on the dark squares. So since black has organized his pieces in this way for everything, so that everything is fighting for the dark squares, he has a very nice tactic in this position here after queen takes c3. It's all about the dark squares. So Jacob Tarallo in the YouTube chat has found the answer. Simply queen takes c5. And there is a nasty pin on the queen. White can recapture, but let's see what's going on here after bishop takes, rook takes. This is going to be a very, very pleasant endgame for black. Although, looking at it, it feels like there might have been something more for black in this position. But maybe it is just queen takes c5. Yeah, this will definitely do the trick, especially because white's king is blocking his rook from getting into the game quite so quickly.
Right now, he got to huddle, got to make 2 moves to get his rooks connected.
Yeah, so queen takes c3 looks like the most natural option, but it's simply not really possible. So then my next question, what happens on bishop takes e6? Black can't recapture because the queen will fall. So what's the intermezzo here? What's the in-between move for black to save the queen?
We can check him?
Yeah, you just give a check. And now this king is actually running quite short on squares. In fact, you might have seen this pattern before. Yeah. So bishop takes e6, not going to be playable. So white is really left with no other option but to accept this sacrifice. And he takes black's queen. Of course, black now continues with bishop takes c4 check, king g1, but now white is left in the unfortunate circumstance where his king is kind of entirely trapped.
Right.
So are any of you familiar with the idea of the windmill? The windmill in chess.
What's his name played against Lasker, started snatching them pieces back.
Yeah. So this is kind of a version of the windmill. So black could simply take this rook on d1 and try to play for compensation here, which he would have plenty of for the queen. But instead, there's this move, knight e2 check, which is very nasty, because after king f1 and knight takes d4, the black king, or the white king rather, gets caught in this sort of cycle where no matter what happens, he can't really escape. Black can do anything he wants, kind of. Obviously, Fischer didn't waste all that time. He simply comes back to e2, back to c3, and now actually captures the bishop instead of the rook. This hits the queen. The queen comes to b4, and now rook a4 is a very nice move, saving all of the pieces. All of the pieces are somehow tied together. The queen takes on b6, and now black captures on d1. And at the end of the day, one knight to one knight, one rook to one rook, and then two bishops and a rook for a queen, along with this devastating looking king on g1.
Pass pawn will be good.
Well, yeah, black's not even thinking about passed pawns here. Black's thinking, all right, what's the best way for me to kill the guy? And that's exactly what happened in the game. H3 was white's choice, trying to give the king a flight square.
And get your rook out. So you got two problems.
Rook takes a2, king h2, and now knight takes f2. And this king is looking more and more in danger. Rook e1 was white's choice. Black simply trades. And after a check and bishop f8, knight takes, we see bishop d5. The pieces are starting to organize themselves against this king. Knight f3 was white's choice.
And the queen's not a good defender.
Knight e4. Queen b8. The queen is trying to defend, but after b5, h4, h5, king g7. And after king to g1, I'm sure you all see the checkmate in 9, maybe. I think checkmate in 9. It's very, very nice. Bishop c5 check, king f1, knight g3 check, king e1, bishop b4, and the king is walked to the queen's side, and eventually
regular game wasn't
stuck.
The time it wasn't a speed game.
Yeah, this was a classical chess game, and Bobby Fischer just demolished him. And so this was named the game of the century in Bobby Fischer's career. It was very, very early on in his career. Like I said, he was pretty young. I don't remember his exact age, but he was an up-and-comer. And this game where he just absolutely destroyed Donald Byrne was definitely one to look out for. So this, I think, is one of the most notable games in his career early on, one of his most famous games. I do have 2 other games here to talk about. But before I get to that, any questions on this game? It's a very tactical game where Bobby really was just sacrificing at every turn after this one early on mistake by Byrne, where he played bishop g5. Once again, it's tempting sometimes to violate opening principles, but unless you have a very good reason for doing so, it's going to come back to bite you. So,
but it has to take somebody with some...
Simply bishop e2 and castles would have been better for white. Bishop g5, just, it doesn't feel right, and it wasn't. So a very nice game from Bobby. Okay, well, let's move on. Do you want to see a game from his famous World Championship match, or a game from his famous U.S. Championship where he went 11-0, undefeated?
That World Championship is Game 6 that he beat Spassky with the... But anyway...
I actually don't remember. Yeah, this was round 3. We'll start with this one because it's pretty interesting. Spassky started with d4, c4, and after knight f3, Bobby Fischer shocked the world and played c5. Of course, what opening is this? Does anybody know? It's the Benoni. So Bobby Fischer had never played the Benoni in his life, and of course it doesn't have the best reputation as far as chess openings go.
But it'd be a good surprise to get Spassky since he never played it.
Yeah, that was exactly his thinking.
All the preparation.
And the Benoni was a surprise indeed for Spassky. I'm sure he had no idea this was coming and hadn't done a whole lot of work in it, considering Bobby had literally, I don't think, ever played it in his life.
Right, so this is psychological warfare too.
So Spassky simply grabs the center, takes, d6. These are the main moves. Spassky chooses this line with knight d2. He simply wants to step off of this diagonal before moving this e-pawn not allowing bishop g4 and things like that. This knight also, a very common outpost for it is on c4. Knight bd7 from black. e4 from Spassky. Bishop g7. Bishop e2. Castles, castles. Black brings this rook to e8. And so far, this has been very, very, very much the mainline stuff. And now Spassky plays queen c2, which isn't, like the absolute most popular move, but it's definitely been tried a lot before. It's not an uncommon move. And so after queen c2, let's take a look for black here and see what's going on. What sticks out to you? What are some plans and ideas for black? And let me actually flip the board so we see it from Bobby's point of view, because we want to be winners.
Right. Well, it looked like black almost got to move that knight to b6 to get his bishop out somewhere.
So the b6 square actually isn't the square this knight's looking for.
I mean the f8, I'm sorry.
Yeah, f8 either. These aren't great squares for black's pieces. Once again, you're trying to find some harmony. From b6, you're not really looking at anything. From f8, you're not really looking at anything either.
d5?
So e5 is a square you can come to, but it's kind of tempting fate there. Once a knight lands on e5, it's a matter of time until f4 comes and forces this knight away. So developing this knight out is going to be a little bit of a problem for black. And this is a big reason why the Benoni is a little bit troublesome, is because black simply has one too many pieces in the Benoni, right? You can't have all of these pieces get developed. There just simply aren't enough squares for them to be on good squares. So a common idea for black is to gain more space somehow. So where can he gain more space? Certainly not in the center. Probably not on the king's side, because that's what white wants to be doing. So yes, on the queen's side.
Like a6 and b5?
Yeah, so a6 and b5 are very common ideas. In the game, however, Bobby shocked everyone, came up with a very unique idea, and played knight h5. So what sticks out about this move? This move should be kind of sending up some red flags.
Well, you extended the knight. You're trying to hit f5, but he can hit f4. I'm saying wrong. I'm trying to hit f4, and he can just push out and get you. Knight on the rim, chance is looking grim, but it also can make Spassky kind of jump at him. Is he dropping a piece now?
No, what's the most natural response for white? Let's just deal with natural moves here.
Bishop captures knight?
Yeah, bishop takes knight.
Yeah.
And what? What is black doing, right? That would be my thoughts if I had the white pieces here.
Well, I'm thinking he's opening that G file to attack the white king.
Yeah, he's opening up the G file, but look at his pawns. I mean, this is just ridiculous,
well,
right?
Got a lost end game, but he want to take him out in the middle game, like me.
Yeah, I guess so. So, what is black's compensation? You mentioned the G file. Right. So if he can make use of the G file, that counts as compensation somehow.
Plus he can grab that D4, D what? Is it D4 square? I gotta count.
Yeah, this square.
Yeah.
So
that hinders white from getting F4 in, because so he's beginning, and the queen can come up. His pieces can actually get to the king's side pretty fast.
Yeah, that's part of the important thing here. When you're looking for compensation, it's good to notice the structural things that can happen, right? Like this G file is now open. I have some compensation for the structure, right? Due to the structure, my rook can get to the G file. But you also have to look at the pieces specifically. You mentioned the D4 square. So yes, we might be able to put a bishop on this D4 square, and that would be a very nice place for it. You mentioned the queen. And it's true that we might be able to come out to this h4 square to make some threats. What about this knight? Where can this knight go to make threats on the king's side?
It could go to d5, because then it's hitting the f3 square.
Yeah, I mean, come to e5, but it's not really to the king's side yet. There's a more important square than e5. e5 is a stepping stone for black here.
F6 to G5, G4?
Yeah, so you can go to f6 or e5, but those are both squares, stepping stones rather, to get to the G4 square. This is where black actually wants to be. This is where you're going to be making these threats against, once again, the dark squares in the white camp. It's all about finding this harmony with your pieces.
Right.
So the knight could come to g4, the bishop can come to d4, the queen can come to h4, and you can see he's making threats along the dark squares. And so this was Bobby Fischer's idea. This pawn cements this g4 square, and that's what he's going to use to launch his attack. Simply knight c4 from Spassky, a very natural move. Hits the d6 pawn. So yeah, I do want to mention, so bishop takes h5 was actually played in the game. And it's true that maybe actually Spassky could have just ignored this knight. And then this move looks a little bit less, sensible. If you just ignore this knight, then like you said, the knight on the rim doesn't always impress. That's my catchphrase that I'm gonna come out with for knights on the rim. Doesn't always impress. It's much less catchy than the other ones.
Knight on the rim,
grim, dim, whatever you want to say.
I got you, but yeah.
But so this knight doesn't make the most sense over here. Black's idea was probably that he wanted to free up this f pawn and try and challenge white's center a little bit, but maybe it's not actually the best way for black to play. But Spassky accepted the challenge, captured this knight on h5, said, "Prove to me that you have enough compensation."
Right.
So after knight c4, Bobby went about doing just that, with knight e5 to start with. This knight comes back to e3, looking at some of the newly made weaknesses in the black camp. Of course, this pawn coming to h5 doesn't only weaken the pawns themselves, but also weakens important squares like f5 and f6. We see now queen h4 from Bobby. He continues pulling forward, making more threats.
Yeah, plus white might have gone queen to d1 and hit that weak h5. You don't have to sit there and let him overcome it.
Sure, it is defending this h-pawn, keeping the white queen out of the game. Knight g4. Bobby continues just following up on this attack. And all of a sudden, what are you going to do about h2? What are you going to do is a very relevant question to be asking. And Spassky decided, I better actually just take that guy. And after pawn takes g4, black's pawns have kind of been fixed, right? Due to these last few moves where Bobby managed to make a checkmating threat on the king's side, white felt the need to fix black's pawns. Why didn't white play this move h3, trying to maintain this structural deficiency for black?
I'm kind of worried about that myself.
So what was stopping white?
Could he go bishop b5 and then the knight would be guarding the mating square, so that doesn't work.
Yeah, bishop e5 actually looks pretty interesting. I think maybe the problem is f4. Hits this guy. Oh, but then there's bishop d4.
Take with the knight and then pin, like I was thinking about. I was going to take the pin gets good.
But then maybe I can just take this guy.
Yeah, but if you take back with the h-pawn, you're threatening g6, and then it'll be mating now.
Well, yeah. We take. You are threatening to go g3.
Yeah, I'm saying yeah.
Yeah, no, this looks pretty interesting. I might have to actually sacrifice my piece back to deal with these threats. It's not really ideal for me. So maybe this would be a significant problem for white. The thing I was looking at, and I haven't checked this with an engine or anything.
Couldn't that H-pawn to start troubling down the board again? I mean, that would be a threat that he'd have to deal with too.
I was thinking, what if black just steps back? then all of a sudden there's still a lot to be proven here for white. If you don't do anything, I'm going to capture this h-pawn. And if you do something about it, I might even have sacrificing ideas like knight f3, still bishop takes f3, and stuff like knight f3 to follow. And this g-file is going to become relevant pretty soon.
And he's locked in by his own pieces, so once you get him hooked on them two files.
Yeah, so what I just wanted to say is h3 is a very, very weakening move, even if there isn't some immediate tactical knockout, which there might be after bishop e5. I haven't calculated that all the way. If black just plays simply, you've made a permanent weakness. This is something that black can latch onto to rip open the king's side.
Get the rook up on that file, then the queen's starting to take the h-file. So you got a lot of stuff going on. So that was better. Spassky was right, you know. That was a more better defensive.
So yeah, so white captures on g4, keeping these pawns untouched. There's a rule in chess actually where if you're being attacked on one side of the board, you don't really want to touch your pawns there because every pawn move that you make is going to create weaknesses, going to create further inroads for the opponent to continue attacking.
Right.
See bishop f4, queen back to f6, having to defend this pawn. Simply g3 from white. And white probably felt that this was a necessary concession. If you play something like bishop g3, black's going to come at you very quickly with h5 and h4. If you play something like queen d2 rather, maybe this is something you can try, but still I think black is going to be advancing up the board quite quickly.
Yeah, but
Things like this will come as well. Move that bishop behind there. What are you saying to me?
You said the pawn gonna tumble up, but if he moves the bishop to g5, the queen gotta go somewhere.
Well, that's just a one-move threat, right? This is not something huge that black has to worry about. You just move the queen out of the way. But yeah, I mean, if the pawn lands on h4. Well, if you commit everything over to here, you still have problems to worry about in the center and on the queen's side.
Yeah, I'd rather do that than get mated. I bet you got mated in the variation.
Well, I mean, there's many ways to lose a chess game, right? You can get checkmated, or you can lose all of your center and then still end up with some problems.
No, sure, that's true. You right.
So g3 was white's choice. He wanted to keep this queen, defending this e4 pawn, looking at ideas of b5 and b4, possibly kicking this knight out of the way.
And plus now, he trumpets the pawn, he can release the f pawn, and white can double down the file and start working on black.
So bishop d7 was aimed at controlling b5, pushing this forward. So white responds with a4, trying to keep it under wraps. But at this point, black actually just has a very pleasant position here. This bishop is on a nice open diagonal. This pawn is actually feeling quite weak for the white player, and black's play on the queen side is kind of going to be inevitable. This pawn on g4 actually does a nice job of hampering all of white's plans. Oh, I just pressed 0 instead of the next arrow, so we will have to find it once again.
Wow, you just said it's over like a 40.
So a4, and then black plays a very nice move here, b6. So why was b6 played? How does this make any sense?
I guess it stops white from going a5 and coming, you know.
So it stops a5, but why is a5 important to stop? You know, why not just rook b8 here?
Well, because I'm trying to think, why not?
Or even just a6. Why not rook b8 or a6?
Because why couldn't he go, where he goes a5 and gives up that other square? But that takes the dark square.
Well, it's all about, you know, finding black's plan. So I've mentioned it a couple times, but what is black's plan here? What does he want to do?
Guess we wasn't paying attention. What's he trying to do? His queen stuck to defending d6 right now. If he could shoot that diagonal open, you know, like get white to move the b pawn, then that bishop and queen barrier would become strong.
Yeah, it's a lot about this diagonal. This is part of black's plan, is how can he loosen up this diagonal a little bit, find something to target on it.
That's why I almost like, well, he can't kill the knight, but the other rook coming to b8 and starting to push up could do something.
So yeah, the actual pushing of the b pawn is the plan, right? We want to push this b pawn up to b4, and now once this knight will have to go away, you can imagine if b4, this knight has to move.
Yeah, that's true.
now we actually have kind of free reign over this diagonal to make threats on the b2 pawn as well as activate our rooks along some open files. So a5 is a huge problem for black here, because now if you ever play b5, I'm going to capture this, and you have no chance of playing b4 anymore. So black plays the slow approach here, because he's in no rush, and plays b6. So now the idea is after rook e1, you can play this move a6, and now against a5, you always have this move b5 in response. And that's exactly what Bobby was planning. So white doesn't play a5, rather, rook e2, and now b5. Bobby just continues with the natural plan.
So he's just putting more pressure on him.
Yeah. So why didn't Bobby play b4 right away? This was the plan, so.
Or can the queen blockade or take the knight? That's the knight.
So what are some ideas for white here? It helps to look at his past two moves. He's kind of telegraphing his idea.
Well, that knight can go back to d1 and that pawn would be safe.
Sure. Yeah, the knight could simply move out of the way, but that's not really a reason to not play b4. I think what he was worried about was this move e5. This is why white actually took the time to line up all of his pieces here. So we could take this, but after bishop takes, this would be kind of a complex line to try and figure out on the fly. You would get this pawn back, but I'm not entirely sure what would be going on in this position. This actually looks like it might be quite good for black still, but Bobby, I don't think, wanted to allow these kind of complications.
And I don't know. It's like black's pawns are real weak now. I thought he'd take with the queen.
Yeah, at the end of the day, black's going to have two bishops and a rook for the queen, which should just be winning. If you take back with the queen, this pawn might be hanging. There's also this idea of queen d6, and you're a little bit pinned up. So I don't know. Maybe e5 is an idea that black was concerned about, and then maybe knight e4. I think this is the point. So this is a common idea in games that I think I talked about a game with Dario Swierz last week, or maybe a couple weeks ago, where he did a similar thing, right? You push a pawn forward in the center, and it frees up a square for your pieces and denies your opponent other pieces that are active. So if black recaptures this pawn, now after knight e4, and for example, just removing this bishop back to c1, this bishop's going to be cut off, and this knight's on a very nice square. And I think this is why Bobby didn't allow this. So queen g6 instead, just keeps things simple. And after b3, simply rook e7, and black threatens to double up. White makes a threat to the b pawn. Black simply defends it, not yet committing to b4. Takes, b4 from white, c4 from black. And in the end, there's just too much pressure on this e-pawn. And Bobby advances slowly, ends up trading off this bishop for this knight, winning this pawn. And he goes on to win this game with the white king running into some danger in this opposite colored bishop endgame. And after bishop d3, Boris actually resigned. And so this was the big turnaround game of the World Championship for Bobby. Up till this point, he had lost one game and lost the other one by forfeit. So Spassky was actually doing quite well up until this point. But this is where it all started to go wrong for Spassky and started to go well for Fischer. And quickly, before the end of the lecture, I don't have time to go through this entire game, but I do want to pull up the critical moment here. Bobby played very well, and Benko did some suspect things in the opening. But this game is famous for... Oh, I just showed it. Oh well, pretend you didn't see. So there's a key tactic in this game here that Bobby ended up using to win the game. So I wanted to introduce this position. This, of course, is the U.S. Championship where Bobby Fischer went 11-0-0. No draws, no losses, 11 wins, a feat that has not been repeated in history. And this was one of those key wins against Pal Benko, chess legend.
Right. Looks like you gotta go what is it, 5?
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Discovered attack, are you hitting the queen, you threatening the piece, and you do it all at the same time.
Yeah, you're doing a ton of stuff at the same time.
2 threats, you gotta try to meet both of them.
And the problem is, what if black plays f5? This is the problem. Queen is attacked. You don't have time to take on passant. If you trade queens, I'll take back with the knight, or even with the rook, and take your knight. So f5 is the big problem. So if you guys have been following the lectures for a while, I do have a favorite way to prevent moves. If your opponent has a move that you really, really just don't like, the best way to stop it is just to make it illegal. So the answer to this tactic, since we're running short on time, I'll just give it.
Put the rook on f5 or something?
Well, close. You don't put the rook on f5. You put the rook on f6. And now this pawn isn't going anywhere.
Yeah, that would blockade it. I should have thought what you said. That blockade it. So now...
And if black captures the rook, now we play e5. You still cannot play f5. Little ringtone going off. And mate would be unstoppable. In the game, we saw king g8 from black trying to hold on for a little bit longer, but it just wasn't meant to be. And Bobby won this game pretty easily.
Go Bobby,
so
go Bobby.
I wanted to show that tactic before the end of the class because I thought it was a very nice one, and it kind of rounds out a few big moments from Bobby Fischer's career. Of course, the up-and-comer who wins the game of the century early on. This World Championship match when he defeats Boris Spassky in Game 3, the turnaround moment. And then this game was also very, very nice. Part of his 11-0 streak in the U.S. Championship. So Bobby Fischer, of course, one of everybody's favorite players, one of the best players of all time. And I thought it'd be nice to introduce some of his games. So any questions about the lecture overall? Any final thoughts that stick out to you guys?
So even Spassky applauded. You know, he played something
Yeah.
that ended up like a Scotch. And when he saw the ending, he's like, how did I get here? You know, he knew what it was, but it was like, you know, that was, you say even he stood up and applauded. You say grandmasters usually don't, you know.
Yeah, definitely. Bobby Fischer, one of the all-time greats, even getting a standing ovation from his opponent at some point. Well, I think that's about it for me. Thank you guys for joining me on this week's lecture. Of course, this has been The Road to 2000, and I will see you all again next week.